Welcome to another edition of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. Over the last few weeks, much of the world's attention has been focused on the tiny Gulf state of Qatar, as they have hosted the FIFA Men's World Cup. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about Qatar since Sepp Blatter, former president of FIFA, announced in 2010 that Qatar would be hosting the 2022 Men's World Cup. Today, we're here not only to talk about the money behind the biggest event in soccer and some of those controversies, both leading up to the games and even surrounding the games today, but really the implications for corporations and countries to participate in events like this, particularly one that draws a lot of criticism from various groups. I'm joined today by Julia Decerega and Rustin Finkler, two directors at Penta, two of our biggest soccer fans, I would note. And we are also joined by Meredith McCleary, one of our associates and one of our producers on the podcast, who's joining us on this side of the microphone this week. Julia, Rustin, Meredith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Bryan.
So I mentioned in my intro, there's been a lot of controversy leading up to this year's World Cup hosted in Qatar. There's been media coverage around issues over LGBTQ rights, over migrant workers. What are some of the biggest concerns from the global soccer community as these games are going on?
Well, look, I think controversy is not new to FIFA, but I think selecting Qatar as a host brought a whole new light to some of the issues that, folks have been seeing for a while. To start, Qatar is not really a soccer country, hadn't appeared in a World Cup or major tournament for that matter before 2022, and being selected as the host. The announcement came at a time when FIFA was under immense scrutiny for corruption, bribery, fraud allegations. The selection of Russia for the 2018 World Cup also did not come without some controversy. So on the surface already, the environment was not sort of conducive to the Qatar World Cup being a non-controversial selection. But in addition to that, structurally, the country just simply wasn't ready to host an event of this magnitude. It had one stadium, and normally you need about 8. It's just a tiny, tiny state, 3 million people, hotels.
It's about the size of Connecticut. This is a tiny country.
Exactly.
They had a lot of work to do.
So everything from infrastructure, they just didn't seem ready, especially when you compare it to some other countries that were putting in bids for the same World Cup. So I'm sure we'll unpack a lot more of this, but just on the surface level, for the public, they did not seem ready for an event of this magnitude.
And really adding on to that, you have to understand Qatar is an immensely wealthy nation from discovering oil in the 1970s. They've been pretty much not on the world stage for a long time besides their role in OPEC. And I think that they really wanted to use this in buying their way into the soccer community as their way of sports diplomacy and really raising their profile on the world stage.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I guess I have 2 questions for the 3 of you. One is, we're recording this at a time when we are in the final stages of the World Cup. We're down to the final 4 countries, and we'll have our FIFA Men's World Cup champion on Sunday, shortly after this podcast goes to air. I'm curious, despite all the controversy leading up to the selection, let's break this down in 2 ways. How is Qatar doing actually pulling off the games? There's obviously been a lot, as I mentioned in the beginning, concerns about migrant workers coming in to help build the infrastructure. And I'd love to hear more about that. There's been concerns and some protests around social issues, LGBTQ rights. But I want to dive into a little bit too of how they're doing right now on the games, with them almost wrapping up, and then really why they did this in the first place. But maybe let's start with that first point.
Yeah, I think, Bryan, there were a couple of things to note here, especially in regards to how the Men's World Cup is going. I think for the most part, I guess from the outset, there have still been some stumbling blocks out of the gate. I think the most notable controversy was obviously around the sale of alcohol, and in particular beer. I think to Julia's point that she mentioned earlier, Obviously Qatar is a relatively small nation that does not have infrastructure in particular for the immense amount of tourism that comes in for hosting an event like this. And there was some controversy around some of the accommodations for folks coming into the country, obviously for a country the size of Connecticut. But as far as the actual act of them putting on the games, I think from the Qatar perspective, they would probably say that this is their opportunity to kind of get on the world stage. For a long period of time, especially in the Gulf region, Qatar has really looked towards its neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as kind of, they are the ones that get a lot of kind of the notoriety. They are the ones that are putting on global and regional events. But Qatar has always been more on the back seat. And they've really used, I think, the World Cup as an opportunity to say that not only have they arrived in soccer, but they've kind of arrived in the global scene as well.
Julia, you follow this stuff closely. Picking up where Rustin just left off, talk to me about what it means for FIFA to go to Qatar, to bring the World Cup there, and what are some of the benefits maybe for that region?
I mean, look, some would ask what the case was for selecting this country as a host. I would say it's a light case, but I think what FIFA would say is, you don't just want to bring soccer to places where it's well established already. You can host in the United States or you can host in Europe somewhere, but they would argue that bringing soccer to places where it's not as established will help increase folks playing the game, will just increase visibility and get more children and people into the game. So Middle East, that was new, just like we saw in South Africa in 2010. That was the goal. In fact, it was a long-standing promise to bring a World Cup to Africa back in the day. So I think that's the case to some extent true. I think folks nearby countries have also benefited if you think about it. A lot of, Rustin mentioned the lack of accommodations. I think some people are flying in. There's somewhat of a buzz around the country. But again, the soccer culture hasn't necessarily been there, and we'll see what the outcome is of having had this event in the region.
It seems odd to say for such a global game, but new markets, and hosting the World Cup in, I believe, South Africa did a lot to bring those African nations into the soccer community. You know this better than I do. I think the same might happen with Qatar. And I don't know exactly when the date was that soccer took off in the US, but I certainly remember attending a game in the 94 World Cup. And that was a big deal for 12-year-old Bryan as he was, playing his rec soccer league. So it can do a lot to kind of export the sport and the culture around the sport. One of the things I'm struck by, and I've followed this for a few years around Olympic host sites and World Cup, is that buzz can be very short-lived. Now, I do think, Julia, to your point, on one hand, bringing the game to maybe not introducing it, but certainly expanding it and making it more popular in different parts of the world is a benefit for the soccer community and maybe some of the sponsors as well. But if you're looking at this from maybe a tourism perspective or putting Qatar on the map in that sense, it's really not a great investment if you look at some of these other cities that have done the Olympics or the World Cup. I think the two exceptions are Salt Lake City, where people figured out you could ski in America in a place not called Colorado, and Barcelona, which introduced obviously a beautiful part of an already pretty popular tourist destination. But if you're London, you're not going to London because they hosted the Olympics. If you're Qatar, I mean, are you really going to see any more tourism or that kind of appeal 2, 3, 5 years down the road?
Yeah, I think, Bryan, to this point in particular, I mean, I think we have to step back here for a second, even beyond the tourism, is just looking at the economic impact of the games, and does that last too? I mean, Qatar spent $220 billion to basically put on the Men's World Cup, which is more than the last 8 hosts have spent combined. So I think just even putting it into economic terms, Qatar really tried to put out the red carpet, not only for FIFA, but for the world itself. And so when we look at kind of even from an economic standpoint, the data really shows that the investment doesn't pay off. And that economically speaking, regions that have put on events, whether it be a World Cup whether it be an Olympics or other big kind of hosted events, that again, economically, it doesn't even impact the region long-term as well. So beyond the tourism bump that they may see in the immediate future, even economically, the impact doesn't exist.
And I think we've seen for past places, the economics doesn't work for anywhere except a place that already has the economic infrastructure. So Los Angeles, for London. And if we're hearing feedback, a lot of fans are saying outside of the fan zones in Qatar, the city and the country in general are just not really what they expected. It's not a place that they would necessarily recommend to their friends to go, especially for maybe soccer tourism in the future, just because they can't drink. They haven't really seen the city itself. I've heard that people are calling it a ghost town. So I'm just not sure, to Rustin's point, that this is going to be paying off in terms of tourism or just economically in general.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Somebody mentioned sponsors earlier in one of their answers. This is a big moment for a lot of iconic brands as well. And increasingly, you're seeing pressure on a lot of the companies that are your historic sponsors of major world events, major world sporting events like this. And it really raises the question, and this is a lot of what we do here around Penta in terms of understanding stakeholder dynamics and helping companies manage that. But with the issues around LGBTQ rights, or someone mentioned the issue with Anheuser-Busch, like it does create a moment where sponsors have to weigh the benefit of the audience and the reach and the revenue that's generated from that with, how it syncs up with maybe some of their public positions and pledges. We saw this a little bit in Beijing. We're certainly seeing it now in Qatar. What's happening from the sponsor perspective? What have you guys seen in terms of how they're engaging with the games, maybe how they're handling some of the controversies that are coming up around the games?
I think regardless of where a World Cup is hosted, the potential for eyeballs on your brand and your product is just massive. I think they were expecting about 5 billion viewers for this World Cup. Not sure where that's going to net out, but in comparison, you've got 3.5 billion for the last World Cup, which is very similar to, for example, the Rio Olympics. So it's a moment that companies, especially the large companies, global companies, can't really ignore and have to really think about how to engage with. However, I think Qatar World Cup in particular has been tricky for brands. As you mentioned, we've seen this sort of consideration and conversation around a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, for a number of reasons, but including human rights violations, which is also something that's been talked about for this one. I think there's an argument to be made for companies to continue to stay involved, but there's also a lot of push for companies to do something with their voice and their brand. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, following the World Cup. And as companies think about the next major sporting events, how they use their voice, I don't think this is the last we've heard of major companies. I think there's some themes that are going to emerge that will be a bigger part of their campaigns around sporting events going forward.
Something that made pretty big headlines before the Men's World Cup started is the Danish key sponsor, Hummel Sports. They made their jersey monochromatic because they came out and said they don't want their brand associated with the values of Qatar and this World Cup. So if you look up their jerseys, it is either all red, all white, all black. There are no sponsor logos that you can see on it. And obviously, Denmark didn't make the biggest splash in this tournament or anything. But I think that that's really interesting that this sponsor pays so much money to be the sponsor of a national team. And they said, you know what? No, we don't want to be a part of this. They came out against it. And they chose not to have their logo on the biggest stage that they could.
And at least anecdotally, that seems to be the position I've seen most of the major sponsors take when they're questioned on this, that they want to use their platform. And as you said, that massive audience to, reinforce their values in their positions, and they can both sponsor the games and get sort of their own business and economic benefit out of it. That is a humongous audience, as we'll hear more about. But if they do it in the right way with the right messaging, can they still communicate their values to that audience that is still tuning in, even with some of these controversies?
And I would think there, Bryan, too, that there's a calculus from the company side where they probably sit there and do a cost benefit analysis, right? In a sense where, the cost of not participating in a sporting event like FIFA and the Men's World Cup, to Julia's point earlier, is just massive from a market opportunity perspective. I was struck when watching the event myself, seeing so many technology companies from Asia and the Middle East that are advertising there, and, looking at why are they taking such an opportunity to do so? Well, Hisense, as an example, is a Chinese electronics company that only owns 6% of the smart TV market in North America, right? So there's a massive opportunity for them to use this platform to engage, to open up a new market, right?
Right.
But I think on the other side, too, we've seen, to your point, some corporations really struggle with, we have been more outspoken critics on social justice issues, whether it be at home or abroad. And how do we really tie our corporate message to this games has been something that I think that they will retroactively look at once the Men's World Cup is over with, and think about how they can really create a more cohesive message potentially moving forward.
Yeah, I'd like to think, but it's a lot of the advice we offer too is even how do you proactively get ahead of some of that stuff and make sure your other stakeholders, whether it's your employees, whether it's your customers in different countries, understand your position and understand why you may still be sponsoring an event, even if there is a little bit of a cloud of controversy around it. Rustin, I want to ask you a question. I'm usually very hesitant on this show to single out any particular company because that's usually just a snapshot in time and a podcast doesn't give us enough to really dive fully into it. But there was a really interesting sponsorship story that came out of these games. You mentioned it, which was Anheuser-Busch, working very closely with FIFA and the country to figure out a way to bring alcohol into the games. Alcohol, for better or worse, maybe is obviously a part of the soccer culture and most sporting culture, right? That's not alone. And worked really hard to figure out the right way to do this in a country that is, someone correct me again if I'm wrong, is a dry country. But then it sort of didn't work out. Walk us through what happened there and the ramifications.
Yeah, so what you're alluding to, Bryan, is that, Anheuser-Busch has been a longtime sponsor of the Men's World Cup. I think it dates back all the way to like the 1970s. I think, they spent $75 million to be the official beer of the Men's World Cup in 2022. And as you alluded to, obviously for many people, soccer and alcohol go hand in hand, and it's been that way kind of culturally for a long period of time. But I think it was, something like 2 weeks before the tournament, they announced that they weren't going to sell, alcohol widely across all the different venues. And I know in particular, Budweiser was upset about this, given that they had worked closely with FIFA and the Qatari government to try to find a solution in which alcohol would be served. To date, there are certain sites, that were sanctioned for alcohol sale, but it was not widespread across the country. So finding kind of that happy medium to both, abide by what are some of the local rules, but also acknowledging that FIFA and kind of the games and hosting a Men's World Cup, kind of the cultural elements and aspect of it go hand in hand.
Interesting debate for Anheuser-Busch, no doubt. Julia, I want to circle back to you. I'm probably jumping around a tad, but we talked a little bit about, how brands are maybe using their voice. You mentioned to me at some point during these games that a lot of clubs as well, or federations, you may call them. I'm exposing my soccer fandom here, but they're doing their part too to kind of stand up for some stuff they believe in. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing through the games there.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just a question of how corporate sponsors would react. Also, teams and players were at the center of this. Fans were demanding it across the world. Obviously, teams come from all over the world. And several of them had planned so-called protests For the start of each game, the US notably used a rainbow crest for their training ground for a good chunk of the tournament. Some captains from a number of teams had planned to wear special captain's armband that would show their support, especially for LGBTQ issues. And, not all of them were actually successful, especially at the threat from FIFA of sanctions that really would have impacted performance on the field. And at the end of the day, only a handful of notable protests were seen. Germany team is one example. I don't know that the protests went as folks had planned. I think it certainly wasn't something that wasn't on players' mind throughout the tournament. It wasn't just about the playing and the performance. Where they were playing also was a factor that I don't think escaped anyone's mind.
In terms of lessons learned, maybe from this games, I'm curious what you all think. There's obviously been in the 12 years since Qatar was named host, a lot has come out in terms of corruption charges against FIFA and other controversies, some of which are playing out or soon to be wrapped up. Some great documentaries on this for those at home interested. But out of that, I think maybe has come a little better governance around how I would like to think how countries are chosen. There seems to be, at least from my view, maybe a little more interest in kind of regional approaches to games. The US will host in 4 years with Mexico and Canada. There's a couple bids, I believe, for the 2030 games that are more regional efforts. Is this something you all see as an answer to Qatar and a trend moving forward, or is it sort of unrelated and just a stronger bid by these groups of countries?
I'm not sure it's necessarily a response to Qatar and how much they spend. I think it's a response to just countries and cities not wanting to spend the money necessary to put on both World Cups and the Olympics. We've been seeing this trend for years. We've talked about the studies that have come out that there's really no economic benefit. There's not the tourism bump that a lot of people always assumed that there would be. And the IOC and FIFA really don't help foot the bill at all. Obviously, countries can choose how much they will and won't spend. Most countries won't spend $220 billion, but it's becoming a matter of practicality. We saw Boston turn down a bid for 2024 Olympics, like
I know all too well.
Too soon, Meredith, for Bryan, too soon.
I was living in Boston at the time, and it was really interesting. And honestly, as a student in Boston, just even in the summer, watching how many people came, I kind of agree with how people were saying, like, we don't have the infrastructure. So single city hosts are less and less realistic, especially as residents and local governments aren't willing to foot the bill and essentially pay out for these multi-billion-dollar games that don't have the impact that everyone always thought that they did.
I'm really disappointed the world didn't get to see Robert Kraft's build your own stadium in the Boston Common and then take it down after the games. I think that would have been fascinating, but we'll save that for another podcast. It is interesting. And I mean, I think it is a strong point. And we saw this even in Washington several years ago, where Baltimore, I believe it was Richmond and DC, made a bid for the games. If my memory serves me right, didn't get too far in the process, but seeing those both regional cities and obviously Canada, US, Mexico, I think New Zealand and Australia, these kind of regional approaches, at least to me, seem to make a lot more sense for that infrastructure tourism appeal.
Yeah. And to that point, Bryan, like nobody's going back to Atlanta because they hosted the 1996 Olympics, right?
Yeah.
It's the same point I would argue to, people go to London because it's the major economic and financial hub of Europe. They're not going there because they hosted the Olympics. So I think that plays into our tourism point that we mentioned earlier in the show.
This has been a fascinating conversation. We're almost out of time, but we did sort of end kind of on the US. So I have to ask the soccer fans in the room, were you disappointed, happy with the men's team performance? And Julia, I think there's an interesting wrinkle in terms of a lot of the efforts from the U.S. women's team to achieve equal pay with men that ended up playing out through these World Cup games as well.
Yeah, look, I don't know that disappointed's the word. I think they could have probably done a little better. They had some spots there of bright performance, and I think future is bright. They're one of the youngest teams at this past World Cup. So I think 2026 at home, hopefully should be a good opportunity for the team. In terms of the women, also could talk about that for days, but both teams, the men's and the women's team, have been working for a long time on equal pay. FIFA does not give equal prize money for men's and women's World Cup. Some people forget next year we've got a great women's World Cup coming up in Australia and New Zealand. But U.S. Soccer Federation put together a historic collective bargaining agreement a couple months ago that meant for the women's team that simply by the men's team qualifying to the round of 16, which they did this time around, the prize money that FIFA gives would be shared equally. So the women's team secured, just under $6 million, and the men's team next year has a chance to secure a payout as well from the women's performance, which hopefully will be a lot further than the round of 16. Fingers crossed. So definitely a fascinating experiment that I think we'll see be adopted, or at least be in a lot of conversations across federations for equal pay. It's not just a soccer phenomenon. Obviously, a lot of sports are grappling with this. And I think U.S. soccer is a good example of, where this conversation is headed and some good results that can come out of negotiation processes.
And to build on just one of Julia's points, on the men's performance aspect of 2022, as a U.S. soccer fan, I'm very hopeful that our 2026 performance does similarly to men's soccer what I think 1999 the women's performance did for women's soccer in this country. Obviously, I think everyone is still struck 20 plus years later with the Brandi Chastain and her sliding to her knees. And I think it really opened up the sport in a sense. And I'm hopeful that 2026, our men will put on a similar performance to inspire the nation and really bring men's soccer up to par with where the women have been for a long period of time.
Well, looking forward to it. It sounds like it's a good squad. I'll take your words for it as I increasingly become a fan. But looking forward to 2026 and fascinating conversation. So thank you all for joining. I learned a lot by recording this episode, and hopefully our listeners will as well. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into another episode of What's at Stake. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter as well at PentaGRP. As always, I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, and we'll be back next week.